Okay, welcome back. Um, so we're going to talk about a few things. I'm going to go ahead and create a new dynamic web project here. I'm going to call it Practice 1. Practice, just practice. Next. I'm going to generate my web XML. I do not want to open up that perspective. Okay. So what we have inside of this practice document. So we have a folder called Java Resources. It's pretty much empty. And we have a folder called Web Content. Now, to just set up your project, if you don't already have it, create a new package called Servlets. And whatever your package naming scheme is, use that. And this is where we're going to create. Hello? Sorry, cat just jumped on my lap. And this is where we're going to create our servlet or servlets if you decide to go with multiple servlets. And I'll talk about that after we finish setting up this file structure. Inside of our web content, we're going to go ahead and create a new folder called views. Now, the only reason we're doing this, bear in mind that the only reason why I'm doing this is to keep my file structure nice and clean. I don't want 10 or 15 JSP pages within my web content folder just there. I want to add it into its own folder, so if I want to find my JSP page and only my JSP page, I know where the folder is. Okay, so our first thing, so now that we have our file structure set up, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the different kinds of servlet projects. Okay, so if I go ahead and copy, or if I just do a new one. Okay, so we have two major project theories. Okay, the two major project theories. Okay, we have one. Okay, so we have a one servlet managing pathing. And then we have a servlet per JSP page. Okay, now these two methods are fairly similar. You will still have the same code. It's just dependent upon where it is. Some pros and cons. The pro of the one servlet managing pathing, it's less. All right, hold on a second. I'll do pros in green. So pro, there's less overhead. And what that means is when you have a servlet per JSP page, you're talking to multiple different servlets, and there is a lot of overhead going from servlet to servlet to servlet. When you have one servlet managing the pathing, it's all self-contained, and you're not going to have all that servlet to servlet overhead communication. Another good thing is the URL pattern is a lot easier to figure out. What that means is this URL pattern up here because this one servlet is managing it, once you figure out this one servlet's pathing, you can just use that over and over and over again. Now pros. So cons in red. File is huge. This is what I found for, I did some research, and this is the only quantifiable negative that I found for servlet managing pathing to be a con, is the file ends up to be pretty huge, and you run into memory concerns. I'm not really sure in this day and age if it's like a big deal, but that is the pros and cons. On the other side, a servlet per JSP page, it's basically the exact opposite, right? We have our pros being files are smaller, and less memory concerns, right? We then have in red the cons. More overhead because you're transferring from servlet to servlet to servlet. And that the URL pattern is not as simple. Because we have all these different servlets, they're all going to have different patterns, or they're all going to have different paths to find. And even if the pattern is going to be pretty much the same for each one, there is sometimes issues where it's not quite as easy to get the URL pattern figured out, as I'm hoping to show once I actually get into the coding. But these are the two methods, I guess. And it's not, I don't really know what it's actually called, not off the top of my head anyway. It's not called one servlet managing pathing. It's like directory servlet or something like that. But this are the two patterns, right? And what happens in the real world, to just so real world scenario, blue. Right? So what happens in a real world is you get a combo. Okay? What ends up happening is you'll have one servlet managing the pathing. And be aware I'm talking about huge projects. So huge. Think huge, like Amazon. Huge. Right? You have these huge projects where it's multifaceted, and you have these managing servlets, but you have multiple of them. And then they intertalk, but the amount of talking between these servlets is very small. So what they've done is they've said, okay, we have all these we have all this functionality that deals with itself. So let's put it into one servlet. So we have all this functionality that deals with itself quite heavily. As a matter of fact, I'll draw this in a different way. So we have all this functionality that deals with self in quite heavily, but it might need to talk to something that's over here once in a blue moon. So we package those in a different servlet that talks to other related things quite heavily all the time, and we let an inter-servlet communication happen on the rare occasion that it actually needs. And this is what happens in huge real-world scenarios. You have multiple managing servlets that deals with a huge amount of functionality, but then it can talk to multiple different servlets. For example, if I go to my YouTube page, the main servlet is going to be telling me to like search, and I can play videos, and I can subscribe. That all happens quite frequently. But the amount of users that actually create videos is much smaller. So they're going to have that in a separate servlet. And the amount of YouTube videos being created per day is a lot smaller than the amount of YouTube views per day. Just because there's a lot less of them happening. So those would be two separate servlets, but each one of those servlets, if I click on this and I go to my channel, Creator Studio, each one of these servlets has its own functionality where it has different web pages and all this other stuff. So these are all things in one servlet called the Creator Servlet. And then you have your basic YouTube under another servlet. They don't really need to talk to each other as often, but it still needs to happen. And this is where the combo happens. All right? So this is essentially the two. For our page, or for our stuff, I'm going to be doing one servlet managing everything. Just be aware the difference is not all that there's not much different. There's not much in the way of a difference between them on a small scale scenario. But because our scale is so small, and I don't really like finding out URL patterns, I'm going to go ahead and just make a one servlet managing everything. All right. So that's what I'm going to do in the next video. Thank you all for watching.